So today I want to pick up on something that I mentioned last week, and that's the idea of death and rebirth. That sort of idea is always exemplified to me by those words of Jesus when he said, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." We go through life hoping that we won't be touched by death, hoping that we'll always be on an upward curve of success, that our lives will gradually build and that we'll experience a growth that satisfies both our ideas about how life should be and to demonstrate to others that we are on the right path. Very Aspen. But it never goes like that. Although we dread it, death is always there to touch us on the shoulder in one form or another. That which we most want to avoid, we often find right in front of us. We've watched with dread as we see others suffer losses or humiliations of one form or another. Maybe a death, a diagnosis, a fall from grace. Part of us recoils in horror when we see it happen to others. And then suddenly it's happening to us. We become ill. We lose a loved one. Our finances turn sour. Life very publicly goes wrong. And suddenly it's us walking that path to Golgotha. We're the ones that people are recoiling from. Covered in blood, we are carrying a cross that will have an inevitable end. And we watch others react and respond to what we're going through. What had previously felt like a normal life, one that was respected and admired by others, is suddenly turned on its head. And we're facing some sort of death. Our cozy confidence, our bluff normality, our assurance of the rightness of our life going the way that we want it to go is shattered. And we find ourselves out of control and going in the wrong direction. It can happen to us personally, or it can be when our cozy middle-class expectations that things can only get better are shattered, and things obviously become worse. As we see our ideas of how life is supposed to go die right in front of us. It can be on a community level, it can be on a national level, on global level, the way we see things. And just think of Jesus' life. Born with a mysterious past, all his friends might thought, what happened in the kings and all that sort of business. A prediction of great things, how he worked alongside his father in the carpenter's shop. He then struck out with his disciples, group around him, performed miracles all over the place. The crowds followed him. And then the growing realization that it was not going to end well. The disbelief of those around him. Gethsemane, please, can this not happen? Betrayal, Pilate, the journey to the cross, Golgotha, and death. We live that journey too. But we hope that the last bit will not tap us on the shoulder. And yet it comes to us all eventually. And when it does, we're always surprised, why me? Why now? Things are going so well. And so we're confronted with meeting with one of what Rudyard Kipling called those two great impostors, triumph and disaster. We meet with disaster, and Kipling in his poem If says we should treat them both just the same, triumph and disaster. But often to us, disaster and triumph seem very real, and we do treat them very differently. Often we continually walk the road of life. Only if we walk the road of life with death by our side can we treat the emergence of death in our lives with equanimity. Only if we are actually walking with death. Khalil Gibran says, if you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide to the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. But we don't do that. We hide death. I've been here 11 years. And when I do funerals, I've only ever had 2 bodies in the chapel. In England, when I used to do funerals, all the time, there'd always be a coffin in the chapel. But no, it's always a celebration of life. We don't ever see the bodies in the chapel. We don't like having that there. We have a culture of everlasting life. But to shun death is to shun half of life and to see only half the story. As we walk up that road to Golgotha and we see the horror and pity in the eyes around us when we're in a difficult situation and we see people not really wanting to confront it, they recoil at our misfortune. And often, walk on the other side of the road so they won't be infected in some way. They don't have to talk to us about it. We withdraw into any comfort we can find in our minds and process the loss in a way that makes us feel less bad. So we inoculate ourselves from the pain that we're being forced to feel. The pain we're being forced to feel. Khalil Gibran says, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. I think it's amazing. Your pain is the breaking of the shell. In other words, there is understanding within your pain. Even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life, your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you've always accepted the seasons that pass over the fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. That's pain. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. Gibran is saying, have the pain, because there's something to learn from it. Because your pain and your death is not the end of the story. The pain that our society feels, the pain that our world feels, is not the end of the story, because unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. We have to look at the cycles of life to see that in any one moment, we're only ever in a cycle. Because as surely as night follows day, day follows night, the resurrection follows the crucifixion. That after death, there is always rebirth. Always mention that thing that James Finney said, that although God protects us from nothing, she sustains us in all things, which I think is a really lovely thought. Protects us from nothing, but sustains us in all things. We are born to die. In just the same way, we're asked to live a life that includes death. The falling away of what has been, be that people or circumstances or feelings or ideas, hopes, expectations, relationships, falling away, money, health, friendships, family, fun, love, joy, and even life itself, falling away. Death walks alongside us through all of it, so we must embrace our deaths as we embrace our lives, which doesn't stop the pain, but does enable us to realize that if we could keep our hearts in wonder at the daily miracles of our lives, our pain would not seem less wondrous than our joy. And I love this bit. And you would accept the seasons of your hearts, even as you've always accepted the seasons that pass over the fields. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is not a one-off event that has its own meaning in time and space. It is a daily event in our lives that Jesus is pointing through the way that he lives. He's pointing to how to live. Once a death has occurred, painful as it is, we are then left fallow. And then slowly but surely, the new green shoots begin to appear that show the fruit of death is indeed growing. But if you don't look for those green shoots, if you just wallow in the misery, you won't see them. If death is the end, then you'll see no green shoots. But death is just part of a journey. The ups and downs in society, the ups and downs in the world's fortune, it is a journey. Where it goes, after we die, I don't know. People always say, you're a priest. What happens when you die? I don't know. But life definitely goes on. Look at the way our bodies fertilize the soil. And in the same way, the deaths we experience in our lives, be they personal, community deaths, or the death of part of our society, or the death of part of our world, green shoots will appear if we're willing to see them. So the presence of death should not stop us in our tracks. It should spur us on to look for green shoots. Often we're just transfixed by fear of what we see. But if we can look for those green shoots, if we can feel the beating heart of life alongside the absence that death has caused, then we will begin to move forward and to allow the love that's within us to sing through us as we call those green shoots into life. There's a lovely poem, The Journey of the Magi, which is T.S. Eliot's poem of the three kings that visit Jesus. It's a wonderful poem, and it ends this way. It says, all this was a long time ago, I remember, and I do it again. But set down this, were we led all that way for a birth or a death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard, bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our palaces, these kingdoms, but not at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching to their gods. I shall be glad of another death. That's the effect that a death can have on us. No longer at ease here in the old dispensation. We're changed by a death and made new. And it's the newness that the resurrection comes through. I'm on my last page, so not to panic. It's the newness that comes through in the resurrection. Resurrection from the Latin word resurgere, which means to rise again. That's what resurrection means. And that rising again is part of the flow of life. Unless we ride the downward spiral into the ground without allowing or looking for the upswings to come. And when we hear bad news, we just ride that in. Fear goes up. We think, oh, goodness, what's going to happen? We ride that down. But we have to realize that we are in a flow. And that rising again is part of the flow of life. But what if there's no upswing? I hear you say. What if it's all down? Would you know, that's just not the way of life. I don't recognize life without a flow. It's represented, all life is represented in a wave motion. Sound is a wave motion, light is a wave motion, everything is a wave motion. And that wave motion is what is behind life. And that wave, it is born, and every day we see ourselves and those around us as part of that wave. We just have to remember that as we go through the troughs, those peaks do appear. If we can just have the fear that we have, to meet triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. And to know that the entire life of Jesus is there to tell us that there is resurrection after crucifixion. And it's there for us every day. We have to be with the death and then the period of time where life seems fallow, and then wait for the rebirth. And when it comes, it will be a new life, and it will be different from before. We'll have taken to a different part of the ocean. We'll have been taken. We're in that ocean as a wave, and we'll have been taken to a different part of the ocean as a new wave carries us along to what will surely and eventually be another death. Because as Jim Morrison famously said, no one here gets out alive. And as we look into our society, look into our world, we have to see the same thing. That there will be death of what we've always held dear, but there will be rebirth, new life, and it'll be joyous as that which has died. Just in the great scheme of things, I just want to end with that wonderful quote from Gandhi, which shows death and rebirth. He says, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. That there have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think of it," he says, always. So we always like to give an opportunity for people to come back to us on whatever's been said up here, either to disagree. We always give sort of these messages with the willingness to be wrong, to either make a contribution, share an experience, ask a question. Sometimes there's a nice silence and nobody says anything. But I just want to give us an opportunity if anyone would like to pitch in at all and say anything. Thank you, yes. Thank you, Peter.
It's ironic that you're speaking.
Let me just check your microphone is on. Let me just pause it here. Yes, it is on, so I think it needs to be turned on. That's right.
It's just ironic that you were mentioning this sermon, as I've had a good friend that lived down valley, recently passed. Yesterday we were at Redbutte Cemetery, laying her to rest with her family, a long-term Aspen family.
Yes. And
then I learned yesterday at that co-worker of mine from the Pickett County Sheriff's Department years ago, before the 90s, 2000, whatever, he just passed away down valley. And but it's a good, what your sermon says is what I truly believe in my spirituality and in my teachings. Anyway.
What was your friend's name?
Walter Geiser.
Well, I'm just sorry for your loss, and thank you so much for having the courage to stand up and say that, especially when I can hear the emotion there. I really appreciate that, Peter.
And the one that passed was Cindy Beck.
Cindy Beck.
Family.
Thank you. Right, thank you. Anybody else like to say anything? Thank you, yes. Robert.
Thank you, Nicholas. I've pondered that parable my whole life about the wheat, the rebirth. And the question I have for you is, and it's hard because I don't want to trivialize the importance of death and the resurrection. But for me, it's hard because I need to bring it down to a real practical level. What does that look like for me every day? So I think about this concept of dying to self. And I'm just curious, what does that look like for you? And how does that manifest in your life? And what does that look like in the world? What does that look like for me? You know, and the closest that I think I've come to that is, and I'll use the two words, ease and dis-ease, right? There's no good or bad in that. It just is. And sometimes I think the death and rebirth is the acceptance, moving into acceptance of knowing that there is no good or bad emotion. They're just an emotion. There's beauty in everything. I don't know, it was just something I was pondering with as you mentioned the death and resurrection,
Yeah.
just looking at it a little different way.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me it is represented by humiliation. You know, I sometimes, you know, when things don't go the right way, I feel a personal humiliation, and it is as if life is moving me into humility. And I don't want to be moved into humility. And as I resist being humiliated, that is when my humiliation, because people see me doing this, desperately holding on, when actually what's asked of me is humility at that particular moment. And I'm taken into that by a fear will take me into that. You know, I will be desperately resisting or trying to control a circumstance or a situation, rather than having a sense of acceptance of it. I have an idea of what's a good outcome. You know, a good outcome in a particular scenario. And I have an idea what a bad outcome is. Those true things, triumph and disaster. And I definitely don't treat them equally. You know, I will, when I'm done well, I'll be like, marvelous, you know, absolutely fantastic. You know, thank you very much, I really appreciate that. But, you know, when it's a disaster, when it's a humiliation, you know, I become small, I want to fight it, and I feel personally as if life is getting at me. I just want to crawl into a hole. I'm not willing to be brought to earth, which is what humus comes from, humility, to be brought to earth, to be brought to who I really am, and to be shown that I am, that there is no particularity about how great or how ungreat any particular person, thing, we're all equal. And we forget that. There's an equality in everything. We had in our forum, Mindai Bastido reminded us, who was the speaker we had in the forum, that we are equal to the elements. We are equal to the trees. The trees are equal to us. We're not better than the trees. But we forget that, and we think we're marvelous. We think we're much better than anybody else, you know. Our party is much better. Our country is much better. It's all bollocks. Everything is of an equality within the spiritual realm of life. And when we resist that, then we face that humiliation because we're not willing to be the earth that we are. We come from dust you are, and to dust you shall return. You know, it's in there in the funeral service. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Eric. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much. Your sermon really kind of touches on my recent life, in that my uncle Bob Petrock, who was a farmer down valley, had a very, very kind of slow death after a horseback riding accident, and then passed away about 2 weeks ago. And then
Sorry, who was this, Eric?
Bob Petrock.
Yeah.
He was on the Picking County Board of Commissioners, I think, at one time, or Land and Planning. Some of you may know him. He passed away, which was a blessing after so much suffering. And then we had Annie's niece give birth after trying for years to have a child. Finally had a child, and it was almost on the same day. So it was so poetic, and it's amazing how your sermon coincides with my life.
Thank you, Eric. I so appreciate that. Anybody else like to say something? Thank you. Yes. Wade.
So thank you for your words of wisdom. I work in the health field. I'm a doctor, and our society has a very difficult time in dealing with death, both financially, both spiritually. We spend a quarter of our healthcare dollar in this country in the last 6 months of life, which I think underscores the fact that we have a hard time letting go. We have a hard time focusing on the quality of life, the quality of the spirit, and when it's appropriate to let go and celebrate death as opposed to mourn it, which is what we do most of the time. And healthcare workers struggle with this all the time, counseling families, and folks in the hospice or if they're, are just some of the most beautiful people because they help in this transition
Yes.
from life to death. The Europeans are much more enlightened about this, as you know. There's been a much more well-grounded hospice movement in Europe than in the U.S. And people live closer together in families, and they're better prepared for it. Here, we love, especially in Aspen, our rugged independence and having our own domains. But that's not the real world, and I don't think it's the real world spiritually either, as you point out. So I just wanted to thank you for bringing it to our attention. We could spend a lot of time on this in our society that would be beneficial and helping us manage our resources, manage our spirits. It's amazing. We have women that can't get prenatal care because they can't afford it, and we're keeping people in the ICU, just to prolong life when it's not a high-quality life. These bring up very complicated issues, I acknowledge, but in any event, thank you for bringing it to our attention. I think it's something we need to talk about a lot more and gain some wisdom from those in other parts of the world where they're more enlightened about dealing with death.
Thank you, Wade. Thank you. You see, Annie's here. There we are. Just give you this. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicholas, for bringing what a beautiful topic and story you wove today. I have offered death cafes for several years in the community, and it's been quite a long time. And basically, it's an opportunity for a group of people to get together and talk about death and kind of carry on what everybody's talking about today. So I'd like to maybe bring one back here. I'll talk to you about it. Maybe we could offer a death cafe because it seems like it's a good, ripe time.
So this is Amy, and if you're interested in that, just go and see her in the little break afterwards. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I've been to a couple of your events, and they're amazing. Yeah. Anybody else? I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. So.